let's look at the ancients and land. Okay, we're going to look at a handful of ancient cultures. I won't do the Chinese and the Indians, and they tell interesting stories. We can also look conceivably at the Aztecs, because over in South America or in the Americas, there are kind of comparable things going there, but we just don't have time for it. So I want to look at the Greeks first of all, because historically they came before the Romans. We're going to sort of have a little duck over into the Hebrews because of the importance of their cultural traditions for our present world and sort of European history, basically. We're going to look at the Romans, I mentioned that. We're also going to look at the Germans, and I'm going to introduce you to an approach to the Germans which is a little bit different. We don't normally think of Germans as being a great civilization and a great culture in history. I'm going to argue that they actually snuck in there and had tremendous influence on our culture today, certainly the West's culture. Okay, let's look at the Greeks and land before about 450 BC. About 450 BC, around that time, is the time of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the chaps that I sort of introduced you to in our first class. What was Greek land like? Well, Greek land ownership was very much on a family basis. Okay? So you had the family as the landowner, and there was a sense of honour attached to that. That the family was, they had their land, they had their location. If somebody asked you who you were, you'd tell them where you came from, because this is your land, your family's treasure, owned by the family, for the family. And if you lost your land, that was a tremendous humiliation. Something that you didn't let yourself do easily. You didn't sell it. And the places where you're likely to lose it, if someone comes over the hill with bigger swords than you and bows and arrows and that sort of stuff, you might lose your land. And that would be considered a great humiliation. And basically you'd fight to the death to protect it. Right? So that was kind of the way that land was understood. But it was on a family basis. Now, there's a kind of a little bit parallel with the Australian Aboriginals, life tenure, all that sort of carry on we were talking about earlier on. Also, the idea that the family's land was a treasure that the present owners kept, improved, for the purposes of passing on to the next generation. And there was a very conscious understanding that the generations flowed one to the other. And so, while Mum might be sort of feeding the baby today, in 20 years' time, that baby becomes the strong adult who is tilling the fields, herding the sheep, doing whatever else needs to be done. And the product of that then looked after the old people, who were the mums and the dads kind of 20 years earlier, or 30 years earlier, or 50 years earlier, who were changing the nappies and doing whatever else. Okay, so there's this kind of intergenerational aspect to the way that property was understood and utilised. Property was very much seen not just as a treasure, but as an economic resource, and so we can identify it as being understood in economic terms. It was understood as a lot more than economic terms, but basically that economic function of being able to support the family was very, very important. Now, it was supporting the family. I'm not using the word family here, I'm using the word clan. Why is that? Because family for the ancient Greeks, especially around this time, further back than 450 BC, the family was understood to be a lot bigger than mum, dad and the kids. It included the sisters and the cousins and the aunts and the grandparents and the great uncles and the second cousins once removed, and anybody who could sort of trace their bloodlines back to the family whose land we're talking about. And now there's a fair complexity as time goes on, and sort of people intermarry and all that sort of stuff. But they were able to work that out, and so you're able to understand that your family's land was back so-and-so, even though you may not have been there for a long time. The support of the clan means that when the fit people in the family were able to work, part of their sense of their personal sense of worth, of honour, of being someone who can sort of stand up and be proud of themselves, was how effectively they supported their family and the honourable things that their family as a whole did. This is one of the reasons why the Greeks were so fierce when it sort of came to, military activities, because they had this sense of unity that came from the idea that what I do for my family, my clan, and eventually my people is really what makes me a worthwhile person to know. Gives me this sense of pride in myself. Right? I'm not a thief. I'm a man who contributes, or a woman who contributes to the flourishing of my family. That was a lovely thing, the support of the clan. It also means that what we would rely on with things like Centrelink and stuff today wasn't necessary at all for the ancient Greeks. Because if I was not able to support myself, but I was a member of a family, let's imagine I'd sort of broken a leg, or I was blind, or I was old, or I was too young. I didn't have to worry about going to the government for a handout. I was a part of my family, and my family would care for me in the same way that if I was fit, I would care for my family. Right? So this is like a two-way street. This tendency for economies to work in an environment where for a group, whether it's a tribe, family, clan, whatever, to flourish as a result of the contributions of the individual members to their collective, family, tribe, whatever, is interesting because it gives you a different kind of we might call it a work ethic in our culture. It's actually surprisingly efficient economically. And it's one of the problems with both capitalism and communism, that both capitalism and communism are based on the idea of what you can pull out. Right? The capitalist kind of pulls out of the market, of their labour force, what have you, what they can. And as a result, everyone's kind of a little bit mean and everyone's kind of pulling out, right? If you're a communist, it's the workers kind of pulling out against, the property owners or, whatever it is. And it's this idea that, someone's going to steal from me, so I'll steal from them. And communism is largely just an environment of kind of, theft. Both of them have to do with pulling out, like what can I take? And it breeds laziness, exploitation, suboptimal performance. When you have an environment where people are valuing themselves on the basis of what they can put in, and they actually do that for various reasons, what you find is that everyone around your table, for instance, is really working as hard as they can to do the best they can for everyone else on the table. You'll find that your little table economy over there will actually do an awful lot better than if you've got sort of everyone sort of sitting around saying, well, what can I, how can I bludge here? How can I get out of work? How can I sort of get a few marks for the rental game without actually doing anything, right? Now, that's kind of like the modern mentality. But for the Greeks, it was the put-in mentality. And it worked very, very well. It meant that if you did have people who were lame, who were blind, who were old and so on, they were looked after rather well. And it was not, oh my goodness, sort of old Uncle Freddy's a real kind of handful. It was something that the Greeks were able to derive a sense of their own personal worth because they were looking after Uncle Fred. And if you understand this character of the early Greek culture, you can understand why Greek sort of culture, the poetry, the philosophy eventually kind of grew up and became, pretty much something that's going to rattle down through history. We're still talking about it. You can also understand why politically it worked rather well. Now, I'm sort of putting the Greek culture into sort of all the good side of it. It did have some bad sides. But by and large, it had this dynamic of solidarity, which worked very, very well. And that is why Greek culture, as I say, in this period was a leader. And even when we get to the Roman era, you'll find that the Romans were still kind of, I won't say bludging off, but they were still relying on a fair bit of Greek culture to add the cultural element to what the Romans were doing. We're getting ahead of our story. Okay. It sounds almost too good to be true. This idea down here, freely adopted, and social sanctions, is kind of important because you see that amongst Indigenous people. And so if you think, what Small's rabbiting on about here is just too good to be true, people are not like that. Look around at genuine Indigenous people today, not the people that are, blind on welfare, sort of drinking and sniffing petrol and stuff. who are not really a good example of Australian Aboriginals, but if you can get out to where there are Australian Aborigines really practising their culture, you can see they're doing exactly the same thing. So actually, there are people that do this, and there are people that have done it in the past. So, you know, while it's, as I say, it's such a shock when you start to read about it. Okay, now we get on to this question. It's kind of curious. The Greek family was a very orderly thing. Again, this is something which is relatively hard in our very flat Western culture. Orderly in the sense that different people had different roles. Especially, the family was structured so you had a patriarchal society. And that meant that the patriarch, the father of the clan, was the boss man. Okay? Now, we would normally think, with our kind of cultural Marxist kind of enculturation that we all sort of tend to suffer from, is that, oh, you know, hierarchy is bad. The idea of having a boss man, well, it's bad. We all have documents, we all need sort of equal rights, right? Let's look at how the patriarchy worked in, you know, 5th century BC Greece. If your patriarch, whoever it is, sees themselves as exercising their authority, their power, only as an obligation which has its end the benefit of the collective, the family, the clan, the tribe, whatever it is, then it becomes a lot easier to follow that authority. Just think it through. If I know that, let's say, you got the job of being the boss, right? And you kind of coordinate and you say, come here, go there, sort of take the sheep here or there or what have you. And I sit back and I think, oh, gee, this person in authority actually knows what they're doing. They've actually got a plan, and guess what? Their plan is ordered towards my good. Am I going to sort of buck and rebel and say, oh no, I want to go off and have a day off today? Right? I'm thinking, I don't understand why you want me to take the sheep out the back paddock, right? But all I know is that if I take the sheep out of the back paddock, I'm going to end up better off because you're trying to sort my life out so it works out better, right? Get the idea? Now that is quite radical in our culture because at just about every turn we are turning against this idea of ordered society, and we all want to be our own boss. For the Greeks, there was this very strong sense of hierarchy, to the extent that the Greek land was owned by the senior father figure, the patriarch of the community. That's who owned it. Conceivably, that's who could sell it. Now, if they did, they were kind of turning their back on their own culture, in the same way that we saw before the break, that the Aboriginal people, lose their right to the money when it lands on their hand. The right to be a patriarch basically dissolves once the patriarch sort of gets too involved in self-interest. Okay. What does that say for everybody else? Everybody else has to follow the rules. And again, if you're confident that the person setting the rules or giving the instruction is doing it for your own good, it's a lot easier to follow. Now, with that kind of cultural solidarity, think of what that does if you try and all band together to maybe fight a war. Right? And the boss man, whoever he is, the king or what have you, says, I want this group of people to charge over there, yelling like crazy and sort of waving your swords and scaring the people, right? And you think, oh goodness, he wants me to go and charge over there, but that's where the enemy are really strong, and that's where they're throwing all the stones and shooting the arrows and stuff. I'm going to be dead. Right? Now, as an individual, I would sort of sit back and go, oh, I'm not going to do that. Right? But as a Greek in this period, you'd say, wow, okay, if I do that, it's going to be really dangerous, but it's probably going to be the best thing to go and help the people I care for, my family, what have you, to actually survive and flourish. And guess what? If we really do it and yell really, really loud, we'll scare the opposition so much they'll run away anyway, so I won't get killed. Right? And often it worked for the Greeks. And you guys have probably sort of read or watched some of the movies about the Greeks that have, kind of come out recently and so on. And that sense of solidarity only makes sense, you see, if you understand what the cultural foundation is behind why it was that those guys did have this really ultra-strong sense of solidarity and commitment to the collective. Now, when you use words like commitment to the collective, that sounds like Marx. These guys are about as far away from Marx as Attila the Hun was, right? But they were committed to the collective. Okay. So what have we got? Nominal owner is the head of the family. Okay. That looks like private property. However, the beneficiaries is the whole family. The old people, the young people, the babies, the sisters, the cousins, the aunts, the second cousins once removed. Lame old Uncle Fred, sort of, Auntie Sue, who's sort of been blind for, since birth. They're all getting fed. Doesn't that look like socialism? What was it? What the free market observer would see is ownership by the individual. Right, let's go for capitalism. What the socialists would see is ownership by the collective. Okay? Was it both? Was it one or the other? Was it neither? Kind of curious. Somehow it existed on a different plane. Later on we're going to be looking at why there is a difference between the plane on which communism, capitalism lives and the plane on which these sort of things operate. Okay, let's look at the roles just briefly. The patriarch I've mentioned, nominal decision maker, was constrained by a moral obligation, and that was the good of the collective. Working age members, as I said, 1 year someone's a baby, sort of being looked after by their mum. 15, 20 years later, they're the strongest people and the most effective people sort of out there working the farm and sort of, making the family a noble name for itself and so on. And they were able to realise their self-worth, apart from being materially supported, by their contribution, by their service to the community. And all of the members were supported largely by their property. So there's a property economics dimension to the early Greeks. Now, the nice thing about it is, I said this is very economically efficient. Once you've got the motivation, once you slip down into the left or right of the modern thinking, the whole thing kind of flags up a bit. However, there's a problem with this. And you guys should be able to sort of feel this problem almost welling up as I'm describing it to you. How old are you guys? Probably early 20s, most of you. Right. What have I been saying about the people in the early 20s in this story? Okay, 20 years ago, mum was kind of feeding you and waving your bottom and all that sort of carry on. Now, it's you guys who are doing the lion's share of the work, and it's the old people like me who are telling you what to do. And am I, sitting around a nice, conference? Am I asking for consensus? Right? No. I'm saying, guess what? I would like you to go out and look after the sheep tomorrow, and I'd like sort of someone else to, sort of put the seeds in the back paddock, and I'd like somebody else to thresh the corn. I'd like somebody else to spend the day weeding or what have you. Right? Would you like to be told what to do? No. So what do you reckon happened around 450 BC? Something changed, right? And where do you think it came from? It came largely from, folks about your age. And I was your age once. I know what it feels like. My hair was a lot longer than you guys back then. Bad news. Anyway, family tensions. The young Greeks. Their effort was largely used for the support of others. In Australia, in industrial relations in Australia, we have a principle that is the dynamic behind what the industrial courts decide, and it's called comparative wage justice. What that means is, I get paid for what I do, and if somebody else is doing exactly my job, then they get paid exactly the same amount. Doesn't matter whether they're older or younger or who they are. Okay? These guys, the young Greeks, were not getting comparative wage justice because, in a sense, their wages, in terms of their real income, in terms of the support they got from their work, it wasn't comparable to, like blind Uncle Fred or something like that, right? Because how much work was he doing? And yet he was still getting the same level of support, or, something comparable, right? So the young Greeks are saying, hey, I want to get the fruits of my labour. And I want to be able to make some decisions, because right now, you know, grandfather or father or whoever it was, he's getting a bit dotty and old. What does he know? Anyway, he's making me work too hard, all that sort of stuff. So the young Greeks were saying, you know, we want a better deal. They wanted autonomy, and they wanted the fruit of their labours. They also had a curious intellectual training that grew up in the 5th century BC, in the high 400s. And that was the invention or the development of these teachers called sophists. The sophists were... Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And somebody who is a sophist is a wisdomist, if you like. It is somebody who puts a big badge on their chest, says, I am wise. Right? And then they went around as teachers, and they got paid a lot of money for being teachers. And they were wise enough to know that the best way to get paid as a teacher is to teach things that people want to learn. And if you're going to be teaching these young Greeks who are short on autonomy and not sort of paid well enough, the best way to get paid by them, or to be certainly their favourites, is to teach them that there's a better way here, and through my wisdom, because I'm so wise, I think you guys ought to have a bit more autonomy and a bit more, you know, practice a bit more self-interest. And that's pretty much what happened. So the sophist movement, today that word is used in a number of different places. We talk about sophistry today, and sophistry is what we would label somebody who is speaking stuff which is influential, rhetorically powerful, but probably based on baloney. Okay? The sophists realise that there's no such thing as right and wrong, true or false, all that sort of stuff. You simply say what will influence other people in order to get what you want. That's kind of the core of sophist thinking. And the sophists could see that the young Greeks wanted a different deal, and they basically gave them arguments to be able to obtain it. So, the new ethic, the new moral foundation, the new summum bonum, all had to do with seeking the good and harm no one. Now that's a moral statement, okay, and it sounds pretty good. We hear it today with the moral expression, do what you like as long as you don't hurt anybody. Okay? Do what you like, seek what you think is a good idea, as long as you don't hurt anybody. Okay? And the young Greeks said, oh yeah, that's a good deal. What does that mean? Well, for the sophists, good meant pleasure. So for the Greeks, it meant wine, women and song. And it basically meant that the focus turned from concern about benefiting the clan to more of a focus on benefiting themselves, what we could call self-centeredness or individualism. To support these young educated Greeks who are being educated into sophistry, a new urban landscape developed, and it developed in a curious way. The Greeks were economically and politically very successful around this period, and so they were getting very wealthy. That was fantastic. They also were getting to the stage where they're getting a bit sick of working on the land. They wanted to swan about in cities and, you know, the kind of things that you do in Sydney. You know, you go along to the best restaurants, you get along to the best culture. In those days it wouldn't be going to the movies, it would be going to a play or maybe an oration, some speaker reading poetry or something like that. They wanted all that sort of high culture. They were able to do that only by developing cities, like big collections of people. The odd thing in an agricultural community is that if you don't have the kind of transport we've got right now, if you have a lot of people all living in the same place, it's relatively difficult for them to feed themselves when feeding themselves relies on them growing their own goods and all that sort of stuff, basically being farmers. I don't think you've seen too many, you know, corn crops or paddocks full of cows, you know, between here and Central Station. Right? You simply can't do it in the city. What you need is, in our case, the rest of New South Wales, to actually produce the food and the other materials that we need, that we live on, right? Where does our milk come from? It certainly doesn't come from George Street. Right? How did the Greeks get Athens to be built? Well, they came up with a very interesting and at the time very novel approach to property. They said, you young Greeks, you 20-year-olds, you who are kind of working really hard on the family farm and not getting very much for it, we're going to give you a new and very interesting property right. We're going to call it private property, what we would identify as something moderately close to, or a lot closer to freehold, right? And basically it was free for you, basically land grant, if you wanted to live in, say, Athens or one of the other cities. And so the young Greeks were able to leave the family farm, go off to Athens or one of the other cities, live really well. They'd have land sort of out somewhere away from Athens. It would tend to be farmed and operated by slaves. They wouldn't be people who owned the land. The owners lived in Athens, right? So you ended up with this new form of individual property right. And the idea of the individual property right was that all of the benefit from the land actually sort of came into the pockets of the owners, the sort of young Greeks, who were then sort of getting around listening to poetry and going to orgies and whatnot, drinking their wine and chasing their women and all that sort of stuff in the city, and kind of getting them cultured. Now, to a certain extent, you can kind of do that. Universities are sort of things that tend to work best in cities, large collections of people, so that's a good thing. Culture is a good thing. And so if you do have people providing, say, good drama or literature and stuff like that in cities, that's a good thing. But there are also bad things you can sort of find with cities as well. So you've got these sort of two sides. The important thing about Greece is that the development of these cities, and we now, and you guys at school would have been introduced to the idea of the city-states, the Greek city-states and so on. Okay, these cities are an important part. The cities were based ultimately on private property. It was a new and radical form of private property. The important thing is the second point here, they were not materially self-supporting, and so you do have this private property being allocated for the citizens, which was not the family farm. Now, that had the advantage of supporting the city, and the city basically replaced the family as the social organising kind of logic. And so no longer were you seen so much as a child of your family, you are now seen as a citizen of the city. Okay, that's dum-de-dum-dum. And this idea that the economic power, which was coming from this new form of property, was not looking after, blind Uncle Bill or whoever else we're talking about. It's actually sort of then available for the citizens, and it enabled them to sort of come ahead and live an extremely comfortable life, and to a certain extent a very hedonistic one. Cultural impacts. Well, the cities were only partly successful, largely because they discovered that there are a lot of bad things that sort of happen in cities as well. And people, by and large, once people get too self-indulgent, if you know that you can live really, really comfortably, you don't have to work hard, you don't have to take any risks, you don't have to, expose yourself to danger, that becomes a bit difficult when you have some serious threat, like an economic threat, like a depression coming on, or a political threat, which could be, some army sort of coming over the hill. If you've been living in a situation where you don't have to work very much, you don't even have, well, they had gyms there just for recreation, but weren't necessarily as fit. You certainly weren't so inclined to get involved in this army business, because after all, people get killed when they're in the army, and when your time is all spent with the wine, women and song, that's completely the antithesis of risking life and limb. Okay. So the cities were only partially successful. Family order was disrupted. After all, the families relied on this intergenerational process where the parents had the children, they looked after them for the first 10, 12 years or what have you, and then it started to, they started to work and support the rest of the family, and so you had this large ongoing kind of process. once you disturb this, when all of the key workers, if you like, were all going to the polis, to the cities, to get their private land allocations and so on, and benefit for themselves, what happened to Mum and Dad and Uncle Pete and Auntie Sally, the blind lady, and all the rest of it? They're sort of out there in the never, being considered as somehow second-class citizens because they don't have the benefits of the poetry and the fine living in the city. And they're also finding life getting pretty tough because all the fit people are all sort of gone, and so who's looking after the sheep? It has to be sort of blind Uncle Pete or what have you. So it wasn't a very happy time there. Culturally, there was a lot of disintegration because people were becoming very focused on themselves rather than the collective. You have a number of social problems coming in, and this is kind of curious when you look at it back in time, because we normally associate these things as relatively recent inventions. A really big thing was the disintegration of national patriotism. The ability to charge around sort of following Alexander and doing all the wonderful things that they did, the 300 and all that stuff, all basically just went up in smoke. And their cultural strength and their cultural footprint basically shriveled up to not very much at all. Okay, we've talked about the sophists and what they were. Now, around the time, the sophists have been going for some time. They had the big badge on their chest saying, "I am a wise man." When you got to someone like Socrates, and we mentioned Socrates in our first class, he described himself not as a wise man, but as a lover of wisdom. He didn't know exactly what wisdom was, and in fact, if you read accounts attributed to Socrates, you see all the time he's saying, "I'm not wise, I just want to find out what wisdom is." And he spent all of his life asking questions. Socratic method is all about asking questions, because Socrates did not think of himself as wise at all. He simply was chasing wisdom. Again, the word, you can see the Sophia in the word. The philo part, philanthropist, is a lover of people. Philo anything is a lover of whatever. It's a lover of wisdom. And so the philosophers came as a response to the sophists because they were trying to reclaim what wisdom really was about. And that's why Socrates, Aristotle, Plato was such a radical departure from the sophist tradition. And they asked questions like, what is reality? What is truth? What is goodness? And questions like that. And they came with some pretty interesting answers, which is one of the reasons why we are still reading Plato and Aristotle. Because even if you disagree with them, their arguments are certainly worth engaging with. And it is, relatively difficult to disagree with them without making a fool of yourself. A couple of definitions in there. Importantly, what is truth? It's a worthwhile definition to have under your belt. Truth is the conformity of statements to reality. I think I might have given that to you earlier on, or at least I think I have mentioned it to at least some of you. That's very, very important. And we might be coming back to that if we have time. The understanding of truth and what it is something that you find changing in its status as cultures rise and fall. And we might be coming back to that as we go. It's one of the reasons, again, one of the other reasons why we still read Aristotle and Plato, because these questions are still engaging us, and we don't always get the right answer, even though it might be the popular one for our culture.
What does that mean if truth is always changing and there is no truth?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept that, for instance, can I say that there is no truth? But can I say? Just think, I could maybe, I could use those words, but could I actually say that? Can I say there is no truth? Yeah. So in a sense, if I make that statement, I'm contradicting myself because I'm saying it is absolutely true that there is no absolute truth. Right? So when we sort of talk about, the idea of my truth and your truth and so on, if we get time, we'll be sort of giving that a bit more space here. It's one of probably the most misunderstood kind of questions in our time. It's convenient for me to come in. You say, I'm coming in, I'm rabbiting on, and I've got to wear a tie, right? I'm kind of convinced you guys, right? This is my truth, right? Small might be total baloney, okay? But I'm still going to tell you its truth for one reason. Because for whatever reason, I might think I'm going to exploit you, I'm going to get some sort of a benefit out of it, okay? But if I come along, this is true, and you've got to believe it, right? But it's actually false. Somewhere in my mind, I'm going to know that stuff, right? But somehow, by convincing you that's what a con is all about, right? So, you know, the idea of talking about my truth and your truth is really a way of peddling lies. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time because it's an interesting philosophical question. As I say, people have been arguing about this since Socrates and Plato were arguing with the sophists. But keep that question alive, right? Don't let me forget it. Okay. Now, I've introduced these people and I've already been talking about it to a certain extent. You know the answers to all of these things, so we can sort of go through fairly quickly through this slide. One of the important things is, historically it's interesting because we've got this sort of genealogy. You know, Socrates teaching Plato, Plato's teaching Aristotle, and then we sort of stop, you see. But there's actually one more teacher-student relationship, and that is between Aristotle and Alexander, who was probably the last great Greek, at least in ancient times. And to a certain extent, Alexander's success was kind of curious because Alexander's success was based on a revival of what had made Greece great, but was largely getting lost out of the culture. Yes, sir?
Literal lineage student teacher, or is that metaphorical?
Oh no, they really were. Socrates did teach Plato, and Aristotle was one of Plato's students. Because Socrates was kind of like the beginning of the tradition, he didn't write very much himself, and so most of what we know about Socrates is actually through the writings of Plato. Plato's writings are just gold plate. If you want some recreational reading to really exercise your brain, get some of the Plato's writings, especially a book called The Republic. Probably about the first third of The Republic is a little bit heavy going unless you've got someone to work through it. You can read it yourself, and I do recommend. I don't want you to put it off your reading. But the second part of The Republic deals with an awful lot of extraordinarily interesting and important ideas. But I can't go through too many of them in these classes. Aristotle came on as Plato's student. Aristotle disagreed with Plato to a certain extent. Some people think he was right, some people think that Plato was right. And so there are these kind of questions which are now 2,500 years old, still to do with these three people, and they did really know each other very well. Alexander really was Aristotle's student, and to a certain extent, as I say, Alexander's success kind of does have a debt to the thinking of the philosophers. Okay? If Alexander had a sophist as a teacher, he probably wouldn't have achieved the things that he did, in my opinion. Now, I've already mentioned Aristotle. I think in the first class I did point up that property, according to Aristotle, was effective when it was a combination of private ownership with common use, okay? Known as Aristotle's dual theory of property, and we'll find that occurring in other circumstances later on. Okay? Now, in a sense, we can see this Aristotelian private property with common ownership in the clans, in the hierarchical family-based property that we started talking about the Greeks with. Right? Because while we had private ownership, it was the patriarch who owned the property privately. Who benefited from the property? Well, it was blind uncle whoever it was, and sort of lame whoever it was, and the kids and the old people and all the rest of it. The entire family benefited from the family's property, even though it was owned by one person. Okay? Private ownership with common use. There's lots and lots of different ways of doing that. We can interpret customary ownership in the same sense. Who owns the property in customary people? Well, it's the tribe. Definitely private ownership. You try telling them they don't own it, they get very cross with you. Okay, we really do own this stuff. Okay, so it's definitely private ownership. But then we have common use across the property. So we see this Aristotelian notion, this dual theory of property coming in all over the place. Okay, now the Greeks eventually disappeared. Relatively soon after Alexander and Aristotle, the Greeks basically slumped their way off the centre stage of history. They were replaced by the Romans. I'm not going to talk about the Romans immediately. I'm going to go across and look at the Middle East for a moment. I'm going to look at the Hebrews and land. And I think in one of the debates this morning, there was reference to the Bible. And in that, we find in the Old Testament, the law of Moses, in Leviticus especially, we find lots of references to property. In fact, there's a fairly elaborate property theory, tenure theory, that you'll find in the Old Testament. Let's look at some of this. The law of Moses in Genesis. I, as God, will make you a company of peoples and will give you this land to your offspring after you for a perpetual holding. Now, fortunately, we had the class on customary title. Right? Does this ring a bell to you? The Creator Spirit
Sure does.
making the land and giving it to the people on a condition, in a sense. Now, we get to Leviticus. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. Isn't that curious? This morning we were talking about the way that customary title translates into leasehold kind of terminology. Here we've got it a long time ago being written in one of the first orderly historical texts. That's very...
And that was Henry George's sort of philosophy, was that land shouldn't be owned, like the rent that's taken from the land should go straight to benefiting the community.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
So,
You see these echoes, these resonances kind of coming through with these different thinkers. When Mortimer Adler put together what is known as the Great Book Series, about 20 or 30 volumes, they kind of occupy that much sort of space. Adler was of the opinion that there is this conversation which has been going right through human history. And in the conversation there are a number of topics. And regardless of whether you're talking now or 100 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years back in time, there are these topics that quite recur over and over again if you know what you're doing. And what you're pointing out is the way that Henry George here, in a sense, is talking to Aristotle, is talking to the author, to Moses. Right? Or at least they're all sort of sharing the same kind of view. And at different times there are people who actually argue with them. Right? So while Henry George and Moses might be on the same team, there are other people that wouldn't be. But also Moses is on side with what you find in Fiji or South America. People have got no geographical or cultural connection at all. Then we get to land transfer. Now this is a bit complicated. I'm not going to read it all out to you. It's a bit complicated. You can look up Leviticus 25, 13 to 16. Now this is kind of interesting, and I do invite you to go off and read this in your own time yourselves. Because as property economists, you should be able to translate that into what's really happening here. Basically what in Leviticus is being laid out is that the land belongs to a family, pretty much like the Greek hierarch kind of arrangement. It would be, in the person of the head of the family. You can sell it. The Hebrews were allowed to sell their land, unlike the Hebrews were allowed to sell it, unlike the Greeks who couldn't. However, the payment made was very curious, because the Hebrews had this really strange social institution called the Jubilee. Happened every 50 years. 50 years or 49 years? Either 49 or 50, I can't remember. Some of you guys might know that. And when the Jubilee happened, the land went back to its owners. So I might sell you my land, and there you go, you get to farm it and live on it, put a house on it, all that sort of stuff. And there might be 30 years to the Jubilee, right? You then build your farm on it and do all that sort of stuff, and you enjoy it and all the rest of it. But the Jubilee year comes up, you know, and they go around sort of blasting trumpets and all that sort of carry on. And what happens? You have to give that land back to me or my kids, probably my kids, you know, in 30 years' time. Right? So the curious thing about this is that really what was being sold was something like a terminating interest, like a lease. And the land price is worked out on the benefit, the productivity of the land. Looks like a rent. Looks like an upfront rent payment. Right? And so yes, the Hebrews would go, yeah, I'll send them my land, no problems at all. But really what they were selling, you know, and as we go through this class, we'll start looking at different cultures and looking at it more deeply. You know, possession versus ownership becomes an important thing. What the title is, what the value is, you know, how it's kind of based. It all starts to hopefully sort of come out of the fog a bit, right? Here's what really being sort of sold is this present value of the future returns of a terminating interest. So it's really a leasehold interest, even though they were using the terminology of ownership and land ownership. It was leasehold, with reversion to the families. Now, observers who have looked at this, there's lots and lots of stuff you can say about this, whether it really happened as reliably as is set out in Leviticus or not. That's a good question. But at least the concept was that it was this intention to have the benefit from the land always stay with the original owning families. They could never actually lose it. You can give away your land interest for 30 years, 40 years, whenever the next Jubilee was, but you couldn't actually lose it. So your children or your children's children or your grandchildren's grandchildren would get the land back. And given that the land doesn't change a great deal, at least in their estimation, their material security was ensured. So it was a curious way of maintaining the long-term material security of the people. I was expecting some Romans to pop up in this slide set. I do hope they pop up sometime, otherwise I'll just have to talk about it off the top of my head. Going to jump now. Okay, we've looked at the Hebrews, we've looked at the Greeks. Now look at the ancient Germans. Now we normally refer to the ancient Germanic tribes through the lens of modern history and our Roman kind of focus. We don't call them the ancient German tribes most of the time. We call them barbarians. Attila the Hun, Alaric, people like that. These were the unwashed, the people who wore beards because they weren't civilised like the Romans, okay? What were the ancient Germans like? First of all, they were a tribal people. They had a matriarchal system of property. They had very strong family values, a bit like the ancient Greeks. Land was owned by the tribe, passed through matrilineal lines. It was not to be sold. And okay, this stuff looks really familiar because it looks very much like what we were saying this morning about the indigenous people, for the benefit of the whole tribe. Because this property traditions, customs, is closely linked to a notion of tribe and tribal solidarity, the rules, the customary rules related to family values, family institutions, what it is to be a family or a member of the family or not, were very, very important and very closely related to property. Just one little tangent, I could have mentioned this when we were talking about the customary people this morning, is that with customary people, while I said that you're a member of the tribe as a result of bloodlines, you can also interact or become a part of the tribe through a ritual, through a practice, and different tribes do it in different ways. You've probably heard the expression, it's kind of associated with the North American Indians, of becoming blood brothers. Okay, even though you're not like biologically brothers, there's this ritual which would make you effectively brothers for cultural reasons and the way you're going to be treated, in the future, and it's got to do with, actually sort of sharing a little bit of blood. The important thing about that is that there is a way of entering outsiders into the family which is like adoption, but probably more intimate and intense in its expectation. Okay, so while you may not be, part of the tribe by blood, go through a particular ritual, and you were entered into the tribe. You've got all the rights and obligations of the tribe, as a result of that. Often, Indigenous people, even in recent times, would do something like that in order to be able to trade with outsiders. Doesn't happen in all cases, but in some cases, in order for particular customary peoples, they would have to, when a trader comes in, whether it's the British or the Americans or someone else, when they sort of came to the island, in order to do more than simply have a bit of a powwow, to actually sort of have commercial relations, you actually have to be inducted to some level into the tribe, because the tribe is only allowed to have commercial relations with other people in the tribe. As I say, it's not that common, but it's an element of that sort of reflects the strength of the importance of this tribal solidarity and this sort of idea of things being for the benefit of the whole tribe. Okay, that's the Germans. I'm going to come back to the Germans a little bit later. The Germans were up there around the frozen north, doing what they were doing, around the time when the Greeks were flourishing. And eventually the Greeks got really wealthy, very successful, very corrupt, and eventually became very weak. And they were overtaken by the Romans, as you probably all know. Who were the Romans? They were a collection of tribal people living down on the Mediterranean in the vicinity of what's now the Tiber River, around a place called Latinium, from which we get the name of a rather old language. It's still with us. And guess what? Their land ownership was ownership by the tribe or the family. They identified themselves, a bit like the ancient Greeks pre-5th century BC, as I am from the Tiber, I am from here, I am from there, I am from this hill or that hill, what have you. This is where my people are, this is therefore who I am. Negligible sail again, very, very familiar. Okay? And in fact, very, very similar in many ways to the ancient Greeks at the time. Now, the Romans had probably more of a military slant on their culture. And they certainly had an extremely well-developed sense of patriotism. To be Roman was to be really something important, okay? For me, if I was a Roman, to say I was a Roman was something that I was very, very proud of, and the last thing I want to do is lose that connection to my Roman heritage, my Roman culture, and so on. And I would do that by misbehaving according to my culture. Okay, that included things like contributing to the community, to the collective, what have you, in various ways. One of the important ways was that when the Roman tribes all got together to sort of fight off some adversary, it was considered an act of honour to contribute to that effort by sending away as many, probably most, of your adult males. Because they sort of got into the fighting pretty well, and they were kind of, built for it and all that sort of carry on. And you didn't do that as a result of, getting conscripted or sort of, what's the pay like in the army, which is kind of our relationship with the army. You might be sort of attracted to become a member of the reserves or something, okay? But you'd look at the pay and what the sort of benefits and all that sort of carry on, right? Back then, you joined the army simply because the leader of the Romans sort of said, hey, there's a battle to be fought, I need help, and you'd go. Right? Not only would you go along and participate in the war, in the battle, but your family would also equip you. Now that's kind of pretty amazing. We just think about, imagine if you had to go off to fight the Afghanis or whoever Australia's beating up on at present, and the government said, well, we want you to come along and fight for us. We also want you to, organise yourself a weapon. We want you to get your whole kit and uniform and everything else. And we'll see you over in Afghanistan because you've got to pay your own way over there. Right? Do you think you'd participate in the army on those conditions? Not likely, okay? But for the Romans, they considered it to be an honour and a duty which was quite happily accepted. Let's look at that. Indirectly, We could say that because the economic foundation of the families was the family land, their land really paid for their army. They didn't have any taxes, at least not taxes the way that we would understand it, certainly for the Romans themselves. But the sense of patriotism meant that the political collective didn't run short, because private families using their private land wealth were contributing to the common efforts or what have you, whether that's sort of fighting off the bad guys or expanding their empire. The effects of running a country like that, two things. One is it didn't have much cost. That's a kind of nice thing from the government's point of view. It sort of helps to balance the public budget. But also a considerably greater motivation and order. Now the Greeks were able to pull this off, before the sophists got in their ear. But the Romans were able to do it, I think, a little bit better. Okay? Because basically it was a matter of honour to be there and be a part of the army, to take the orders and so on. And you had this interest in doing whatever had to be done so you get back home to your families and all the rest of it and sort of live comfortably. I want to stress, or rather point out, a change which happened in Rome around the middle of the 2nd century BC, around 150 BC. It didn't actually happen on that day, the 1st of January 149 AD or BC being completely different to, the 31st of December 150 BC. It happened over a period of probably, most of it happened over a period of one generation, but you could probably sort of stretch it out over two. But in historical terms, it happened pretty quickly. Around that date, maybe 25 years before to 25 years after, more or less. So maybe about 175 to 125 BC, you had this change in culture in the Romans. Okay? Here I want to talk about the early, what Rome was like beforehand. Okay? Give you an illustration of that. I'm going to tell you a little story about when Rome beat up on Carthage. The Phoenicians, which sort of come from the Middle East, originally they had a maritime empire. They were really good at building boats, and they controlled more or less the Mediterranean. They had a city in northern Africa called Carthage, and it was fairly successful. And they ran their maritime empire. So they were floating around the Mediterranean, buying things from here, selling them from there, and the Phoenicians had these centres of civilization and trading and so on, dotted around the edge of the Mediterranean, especially Carthage. Rome versus Carthage. The Romans, by the stage of the time we're talking about here, had established a modest land-based empire. They were good at marching people over hills and dales. They were very good at military organisation for land battle. And so they had basically expanded their empire and their political influence, okay, into what we would now know as Europe and maybe a little bit in the Middle East and stuff, certainly Turkey. Okay, but they weren't really good on the water. So the Phoenicians were good on the water, their centre was Carthage, Rome was good on the land, and they had these two empires. What happened? Okay, we already talked about that. But the Phoenicians were very different to the Romans in one thing. Their religion, and basically every civilization is based on a dominant religion, their religion was kind of focused around, or at least one aspect of it, included infant sacrifice. They used to murder babies as a form of satisfying their gods. And so if they wanted a good crop, they'd murder a few babies, and if they wanted something else to go right for them, a battle or something, they'd murder a few more babies. And the Phoenicians were kind of pretty comfortable with this. It got up the nose of the Romans big time. They looked at that and they thought, what kind of a human being would kill babies? These people have to be stopped. Now the Romans had that as just a sense of outrage or moral, offence. Okay? They had a problem. Rome was on the north of the Mediterranean. Carthage, if you like, was, I won't say due south, but more or less, right? Across the Mediterranean. Sail south from Rome and you bump into Carthage without too much trouble. Okay? Who ruled the Mediterranean? These chaps who were really good at building navies, really good at fighting on the sea, okay? And so to get across to go and get the Carthage, whatever they were, tell them that murdering babies is not a good idea, was actually fairly difficult for the Romans. They had a problem. However, they also considered that Carthage had to be stopped. The Romans started off by building a navy and chopped down a few trees, sort of trained up a few people to be sailors, put a whole lot of their soldiers on the navy, and they sailed across the Mediterranean to go and sort of take out Carthage. And guess what? Their navy wasn't as good as the Carthaginians, and they got themselves sunk. And the Romans could have done the sensible thing, which is sort of go home, those of them who weren't waterlogged, and do something else. Maybe go up into Germany or Spain or spend their empire into Britain. They didn't do that. They built another navy. They chopped down a few more trees, trained up a few more sailors, equipped their boats with a whole lot of sailors and soldiers and stuff, sailed across down to Carthage again. Their navy still wasn't up to it. They got sunk again. They could have done the sensible thing, go home, expand their empire on land where they were really, really good, where they had the military technology to actually sort of, maybe they could have built their empire all the way around the long way. They weren't up to that. They were really in a bit of a hurry. They wanted to take out Carthage. They didn't like murdering babies. They built a third navy. By the time they got their third navy sorted out, they'd actually worked out how to do the job, and they did it very effectively. They wiped out Carthage, sowed salt into the fields, so even the very land wasn't able to support life and crops and so on, because the Romans just didn't want Carthage to come back. They didn't like the idea of murdering babies. So you had this curious story all about what was really an extraordinarily expensive military campaign over a difference of opinion about something which really doesn't have to do with economic success or military expansion or anything else. Okay? Gives us an idea of what the early Romans kind of thought their role in the world was. They saw themselves as destined, as having some kind of obligation to the world to civilise it, to get rid of the really sort of strange behaviours that some people did. And they were willing to lose 2 navies in order to achieve that end. Now, that's not the sort of thing which is necessarily, motivated by self-interest. It certainly wasn't in the self-interest of the first 2 navies that sort of went down into the drink. Okay. And this point about Rome seeing itself very, very consciously, the Romans were very aware that their obligation, their cultural obligation, wasn't simply to their family and their clan, the way that we sort of talked about earlier on, and the way the Greeks saw it, but they saw it as obligation to civilise the whole world, or at least the whole world as far as they were aware. Okay? And the idea of domination was not so strong. Now, we're talking about the Romans here before 150 BC. And some of you guys are probably sitting there thinking, well, hang on, small is a real goose, right? I'm telling you a story about the Romans, which is totally different to everything I've learned at school. True? Because it's certainly different, the story I've just told you, to everything I learned at school. However, what we learned at school had to do with what Rome became this side of that magic date, 150 BC. Okay. Often, usually, Rome left the local land tenure in place. So they didn't come along and steal people's land because they realised how precious it was a treasure. And instead they would levy a tribute, a tax if you like, to basically maintain the empire and all that sort of stuff. And in return for that tribute, that tax, the Romans would come in and they'd build really good roads. They would introduce water supplies, sanitation. And so if you were a part of the Roman Empire in this era, having the Romans come to town was actually a good thing. Okay, you had to pay a tax, that was a bit ugly, right? But you got Roman law and order, so you could sleep better at night. You got Roman roads, so you could travel easier, so it was really good for commerce, for merchants were able to flourish, you're able to buy and sell things kind of from further afield. It's more with greater safety. You had health and sanitation improved. Culturally, You had Greek culture. You could, read the Greek sort of plays and their poetry and all the rest of it, and read the philosophers and all the rest of it. So your education was going to improve. There are a whole lot of, if you like, sort of social and material indicators that all went sort of positive as a result of becoming part of the the Roman Empire. Okay, what we might do, we'll take a break now. If we take a break for 5 minutes would be better than 10 minutes, but I'll start at 3:15, and we'll talk about what happened after this magic date of 150 BC. It also has to do with property a fair bit. It also has to do with everything else about Rome. 10 minutes? Zoom. Go back into our class and so on. And we will go through. Now we're down to about half a dozen slides to the end of the day, so we're actually not far off. And I just actually reminded that when I used to, last time I ran this class, often we wouldn't worry about the last break because people prefer that early exit rather than taking a break within an hour of the end of the day. Anyway, we can sort of talk about that as we go along. Okay, we've been talking about this magic date, 150 BC, give or take 25 years, okay? And I've given you a rosy view of what Rome was like, almost a fairy tale view. When I first read it, by the way, it took me about 2 years to believe it. I read a couple of historians about it that sort of basically blew out of the water everything that I'd learnt about Roman history and about the Greeks and stuff, but especially about Rome. Rome I found really, really challenging to get my head around. So I came across a couple of historians that sort of set this view out. They really challenged my idea what was reasonable. And so for 2 years, I took every opportunity to ask questions of every card-carrying historian I ever ran across, whether they are professors at university or teachers in high school, people who specialise in taking people through the HSC, so they've done their ancient history pretty thoroughly. I asked them all about this. I mean, this stuff really, is this what happened? And the thing that I found surprising was that none of the people I asked over this 2 year period, admittedly I wasn't doing this full time, you'd sort of go to social occasions and you'd sort of meet some chap, or maybe at some university sort of deal, you'd come across the history faculty. I asked them always the same question. And none of them were able to, if you like, rebut the view I'd come across from these historians. Now, if you want to read in your own time, there's stuff to go and check whether what I'm on about is true or not. I would recommend the Zimmerman book that I mentioned earlier, and if you're interested, I'll go back and find the exact title of the book. I think it's probably still in print. I think it was published in the 1930s or the 1940s, somewhere around there. It might have been 1940 something or other. Zimmerman's Family and Civilization, I think is the name of the title, but it's something like that. Karl Zimmerman, K-A-R-L, I think it was Karl with K. He lays this out. There was another book, actually I only just found it recently, I got it in PDF by a chap by the name of Unwin, and as I say, I've only just started to flick through it. Not exactly on this topic, but it deals with a particular element of cultural strength and weakness over this period. Unwin, I think it was published in 1932. If you're interested, I could tell you the exact citation for it, and as I was sent or somewhere I downloaded the PDF of the entire book, and I've been sort of picking through it in the last couple of months or so. And it's basically telling the same story. So there was Zimmerman, this Unwin book recently. There's a handful of others that just escape my mind now. There was an interesting historian by the name of Hilaire Belloc, B-E-L-L-O-C. It's a French name, I think it's French. He was an Englishman, oddly enough. And he served around 100 years ago as a member of the House of Commons in England, so he's a fairly prominent public intellectual, I guess we'd call him today. Also, he made most of his money by writing history books, and his history books didn't quite sort of fit with the way that English history commonly was written, but he annoyed the English historians by writing them from actual records and stuff rather than sort of common belief and so on. And when Hilaire Belloc looked at the history of Europe as a bigger issue, he wrote it in a way which was kind of like stripped away from a lot of the political ideology which had come to dominate the English historical tradition at the time. And as I say, when I was reading Belloc, that's when it took me the 2 years to go and get my head around what was really going on. I only came across Zimmerman considerably later, but there are a lot of other minor authors as well that sort of tell the story. The 150 BC date I got from Zimmerman, but again you find it also in other authors as well. Okay. The change that happened around 150 BC started with an ethical change. And it was kind of curious because these things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen as a result of all sorts of political, social sort of changes. Okay? The ethical change that happened to the Romans was that they started to get cultured and they started to read the Greeks a lot, and they were, they were very, very intense, the Romans. They did see themselves as, with this cosmic role to civilise the world, but they saw it in terms of civilisation, and they did try to take the best of what the different countries that they brought into the empire had to offer. So they got the engineering and geometry from the Egyptians. They got the poetry and the culture from the Greeks. They got the sense of law, oddly, from the Hebrews, because the Hebrews written their book back with Moses, and they were kind of very good at juggling around how to get around the law. The Hebrews ended up being magistrates all over the Roman Empire because they were just really, really good legal thinkers. And they probably got the wine from France, I don't know. But basically, if they go into a country and find somebody who did something better than they did, they didn't sort of just beat them up and go elsewhere. They actually said, oh, okay, we'll learn from here. And we'll then spread it through the entire empire. And so it was a very civilising force. But I think they started reading the sophists too much, I think. And when you read some of the Roman philosophy, I guess, there was a movement in Rome. It flourished probably after 150 BC, known as Stoicism. Stoicism, the word means porch, as in like your front veranda. And the Stoics used to run these schools or academies, whatever you like to call them, where they would basically sort of sit in something like a veranda or balcony, and they would just sort of ponder on the meaning of the universe and this sort of thing. The Stoics are in many ways very, very similar to the Sophists. And you guys, if you're interested, might want to go off and read about the prominent Sophists and the prominent Stoics. The Stoics probably sold their line a bit better. The Sophists were there basically, do good, which means, enjoy as much pleasure as you like, but don't harm anybody. The Stoics are a little bit more subtle than that. They come along and they said, well, bliss is the object of human existence. Bliss, feeling really good, right? And they were a little bit more variable in how they define it, more than just sort of hedonic pleasure. But ultimately, the Stoics, when it all boiled down, were not very much different to the Sophists. They were really after self-interest. And that's kind of a fairly long and complicated debate. We could sort of spend a couple of classes just on that alone. But what I want to do is get you to think about the key ethical change. Okay? We told the story about Carthage before the break. Carthage must be stopped because, there was a disagreement over religious difference, basically. How did you appease the gods? Which, these days you think, who'd go to war for that? It really sort of tells you that regardless of whether you agree with infant sacrifice or not, the Romans were fairly motivated in that direction. By the time you get to this, 2nd century BC, there was this shift towards a more philosophical outlook and probably a loss of interest or belief or attention to the panorama of Roman gods as they were. And so they still have the gods, but they wouldn't believe in them really. And they started to think ethically, but then they changed their ethical foundation. Really key ethical change has to do with the word virtue. Now, virtue comes from a Latin word which basically means male strength. Okay? Like, you know, some of the blokes in this room, I would like to have as friends on a dark night in a scary place. Okay? Because if you're enemies on a dark night in a scary place, you guys could probably beat me up sort of, you know, without too much trouble at all. And certainly the ladies wouldn't be in good shape. Or maybe you guys might sort of spend more time in the gym than sort of appears on the outside. But the thing about it is that this idea of virtue comes from the idea of strength. But the Romans were subtle enough to see that strength is not merely physical strength. It's not like sort of the Incredible Hulk strength. A big part of strength is what's happening up here. Moral strength, cultural strength, what have you. Yeah. The Romans kind of had that worked out early on, so their idea of virtue was fairly important. But then they sort of changed their focus a little bit. And so their focus was that virtue went from what you and I would probably understand, you know, the English word virtue meaning, to virtually meaning, you know, and we admire the virtuous man, the person who has integrity. It sort of changed to we admire the strong man, the man who gets what he wants, the man who is effective, the man who can make himself emperor. And you see this sort of transition in the way the political organisation of Rome, away from kings to emperors and so on, and the emperors started sort of, you know, warring with each other and knocking each other off and assassinating each other and all sorts of, you know, interesting kind of things. So if you're familiar from school with studying Julius Caesar, you would see the way that emperors, you know, it was a fairly risky life being an emperor because your mates were likely to stab you in the back. Et tu Brute. But what was really changing underneath all that was a difference in ethics, a difference in morals. And this idea that the only virtue was power, the strong man was the good man, meant that admiration stopped going from people that were, like, if you like, sort of ethically good, to people that were good in other ways, or strong in other ways, or effective in other ways. So if you're a good thief or a good military tyrant, you know, it sort of all started to get sort of, you know, merged into the mix. Later on, there's a chap by the name of Max Weber, who wrote a book. We're getting ahead of ourselves in the story, but he was basically observing a similar thing happening probably 1.5 millennia later on. But this change in ethics from virtue being what we'd understand as virtue to virtue meaning the strong person, the strong man, was really, really important. Well, it was kind of scary because it really spelt the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. What was starting to happen? What have we got here? Oh, yeah. What was starting to happen was that Rome would go to war to expand the empire, and they would do the traditional thing that they've been doing for hundreds of years, and that you know, Rome needs an army, and therefore, you know, Dad and the older sons would all, you know, pack their pack and sort of pick up their swords and march off to Gaul or Brittany or wherever it was that they were doing the fighting. Okay, and back in those days, when you had a war, you didn't sort of hop on a truck or an aeroplane or what have you to get there. If the Romans wanted to, you know, fight a war in Spain or in Britain or what have you, they'd walk there, by and large. It takes time, and it takes resources and all the rest of it. And so if you're going to be, you know, in the Roman army, you know, fighting for Caesar against the Britons, it takes a long time to get over there. You're going to be sort of up there for a while and you're going to come back. Okay? Why am I telling you this story? Well, it's kind of curious because what was happening was that Rome as an entity, as the empire was getting stronger, the leaders were getting very wealthy because they tended to be the leaders of the Roman armies, and so they were able to take the spoils of battle home. They were also able to take home as spoils of battle a lot of the people. So if I have a fight with you and you're an opposing army and I beat you, I might necessarily kill you. I might bring you home as my slave. What would I do when I got home? Well, that you then sort of got to plough my back paddock or what have you. And so the wealthy Roman families were developing more and more slaves who were providing them with a really nice labour force for their land. They had their Roman land, and we've sort of talked about that, sort of, you know, family, treasure, all that sort of stuff. However, there was a strange rule in Roman land law that said that you really only should have that amount of land that you're able to look after. A bit like what we're talking about with Tom Small, sort of last class, right? Why have more land than your family can actually manage, okay? And so the deal was that if there was land that was left idle, other people who were able to husband it, to actually use it, if they came in and looked after it and got product off it and all the rest of it, it became theirs. We would understand that today as our principle of adverse possession. Okay? Now, just think about this. You've got the wealthy Roman families who were, senior families in the empire and the generals and whatnot, in some cases. They're getting more and more slaves. So they get more and more workforce, right? Meanwhile, you might have your family farm. You might have 20 members of your family might be, working the family farm. Okay? Rome sort of does the call to arms. And so you go off as, the head of the family. You take all of your fighting fit sort of sons with you. And you walk across to Gaul or to Brittany. Okay? What happens to your farm while you're away? Well, what kind of manpower have you got if you don't have any manpower? You end up with a back paddock not getting ploughed. Next door to you might live a senator's family. They've got sort of slaves coming out their ears. And they look over and they see your back paddock and they say, oh, well, that could be our back paddock. In fact, we've got the labour force to actually use it. And so 6 months later, when you walk back from Gaul, guess what happens? You walk in and say, thank goodness that's over. Let's go and get the crops in. You go over into the back paddock and you find it's not there anymore because your neighbour now has got it and they've had the slaves kind of working it for the last 6 months. And guess what? With Roman law, you've lost it. And so the family farms, the family properties, the family estates were shrinking. Why were they shrinking? The really bizarre and almost berserk thing here was they're shrinking because of patriotism. Okay? You were good enough to go off to fight for Rome by sort of walking over to Gaul with all of the elder sons. Okay? You were patriotic. What was your reward? You came home and you were disenfranchised. Creepy. Now, do you think that was a real incentive for patriotism? Okay. Not likely. And the Romans they were pretty smart people. They kind of worked out after a while that, if the emperor kind of calls, you do everything you can to avoid sort of going away with them. Yep.
Is that partly why the Roman army first sort of reinvigorated itself after the Carthaginian invasion? How it was mainly you had to be a Roman citizen to be in the army, and then later on that changed as they started to hire more foreigners to be in the army.
Yep, and we're going to get to that part of the story. Yep. You can see the whole, the logic of what's kind of happening here. The good people are being penalised. The people that are, got a little bit ahead, they've got a few more slaves, they're able to basically expand their land wealth, and the more land wealth they've got, the more slaves they can buy, and the more slaves they can buy, the more land they can kind of go and squat on. And so the whole thing was becoming quite sort of, predatorial, parasitic, some words like that might work. Okay, so it was a disincentive for that kind of patriotism. It also meant that Rome started to find it difficult, getting recruits for their army, which is your point. We're going to come back to that as we go along. It's a really important part of the story. And then on what was left of the family farm, you don't have the back paddock anymore. Are you able to feed your extended family? Not very well. You might just have a little garden around the house, or you might have still a moderately sizable estate, but certainly a lot smaller. But your capacity for economic self-sustainability was diminished. Your ability to look after your own clan, your ability to supply the equipment and the resources you needed to go off and participate in a game like sort of playing soldiers was diminished. Okay? And as that continued, that became very difficult because it was only the land that was able to be managed by the old people and the lame and the women and the kids that was all that was left. Not a really good deal. Now, that led, as I say, it sort of accelerated this moral decay, this ethical decay. the senators' families and the patricians and whatnot, they were all sort of swanning about, sort of inventing arguments to say why what they were doing was a good thing, why they were kind of good and noble. And the kind of arguments that we use today, or sometimes you use today, but especially sort of like the serious neoconservatives, that the poor are kind of responsible for what they're doing. So we shouldn't give welfare and all that sort of stuff. Well, maybe to a certain extent there might be a little bit of validity in that argument. But the idea that it's the poor that are responsible for their condition means that it's the wealthy who have some sort of a right to becoming wealthier. Now that was kind of the argument, or one of the arguments kind of lurking in the background here. So we see an argument which is currently in our political thinking, also existing back here, a couple of thousand years earlier. There's another really important point I've got to make about the Romans. No, I'll get to it. Labour for slaves. Oh yeah. By using slaves, they're able to basically grow enormously because they're using a workforce which isn't related to their tribal clan, and they're getting it at very low cost. And that's something which I invite you to sort of think about as we go along. The other side of it, though, was that you get Dad and the boys coming back from the war, okay? Not only do they not have their land, but they're getting a bit hungry, right? Because they can't actually produce enough food to actually support their family. What's going to happen? They used to be able to do that. 6 months ago, they had a farm that was big enough to supply all of their material needs and supply the needs of all of their extended family. Now they can't. What are they going to do? Well, they could go and knock on the door of their neighbour and say, any jobs about? I hear that you've got a back paddock over there that needs a few hands to sort of get it to work properly. We're really good at operating that back paddock of yours. Give us a job. Now, the senatorial families, when they sort of answered the door and sort of heard that plea for a job, what were they going to say? Well, they're going to supply or apply a bit of very simple free market theory. They'd say, well, yeah, sure, you can have a job. The going rate for wages is the same as we're paying this chap with a darker complexion than yours because we got him from the south of Spain or the Middle East or somewhere. In other words, we will pay you wages, you Roman citizen, as a free man, which are about the same as the income that we're paying our slaves. Does that sound like a good deal for Dad and the boys who've just come back from fighting for the empire? Not really. Okay. And so the Romans would sort of go back home and they'd say, what are we going to do now? And they were sufficiently patriotic and confident that Rome was going to look after them that they did a rather interesting thing. They said, well, okay, the family farm's no longer going to support us, or at least most of us, probably hit the road. What would they do? They used to walking, they just walked back from Gaul. They just walked down the road, and all roads lead to Rome. Okay? And they'd go down into Rome and they'd knock on the emperor's door and they'd say, hey, guess what? We 6 months ago we were sort of fighting for Gaul for you, we've done a really good job and we, risked life and limb. Can you look after us? Because we came home and our farm has shrunk and we can't live there anymore. For the first time in history, we had a curious phenomenon in Rome. First time in history. We had a curious economic phenomenon that now we consider to be normal. It had never existed before. It is called unemployment. You don't have unemployment where there's reasonable access to land. Certainly in an agricultural situation. Okay? But Rome is the first historical example of widespread unemployment. Why? Because the powerful families in Rome, the good families, according to this new ethic, virtue means strength, were getting bigger and bigger. Everyone else, who still were Roman citizens, were getting poorer and poorer. Okay? And for the first time in everyone's history, they could not feed themselves. They were unemployed. Now, what do you do when you have enough of your population unemployed? Well, you can watch them starve. There was actually a problem with watching these people's stuff. Can anyone guess what the problem for the emperor would be when these particular people came knocking on his door and said, please feed us, so we don't have a job? Yeah, they're soldiers. Yeah. Now, from the emperor's point of view, and by this stage, and especially as you get sort of well past the magic year of BC 150, the emperor, he is wine, women and song, orgies. His favourite recreation is assassinating his opposition, right? Now, do you think he's personally going to be sort of standing up against basically an army of unemployed soldiers coming and knocking on his door? Right? What's he going to do? What's that? Well, that's what we do these days. But what he did, he came up with a radical solution. The solution was what we would call unemployment relief today. We now laugh and use as a topic of derision the expression bread and circuses. What were the bread and circuses? That was what the Roman government, the emperor, did to keep the unemployed soldiers, largely, happy and fed. Bread and circuses. Bread, they fed them. Circuses, they kept them entertained. And so watching people eat each other or sort of get eaten by the lions kind of down in the Colosseum and stuff was the Roman emperor's way of keeping these armed, hungry soldiers from basically, sacking Rome. Okay? And so, the bread and circus, it's kind of curious because we sort of, these days, we simplify and summarise our history. And we say, oh yeah, bread and circus, that's when the government gives all these free handouts to these hangers on, these no-gooders who really sort of should get out and get themselves a job, right? Well, if you understand the history of it, it actually came because it wasn't that they were lazy no-gooders, it was because they were actually hard-working, patriotic Romans that they ended up sort of knocking on the door. And so unemployment relief, it sort of changed the perspective, when you see that very often the unemployed, and it's still the same today, often unemployed, and I'm not talking about drug addicts and people that couldn't give a hoot, but often unemployed are people that do fall on hard times for whatever reason, and sometimes it's quite beyond their control. And it sort of changes our perspective as to just how harsh we should be with sort of sending them away to look after themselves. We find that, that idea, that issue, sort of initiated in the experience of the bread and circuses in Rome. Okay. We've talked about that last thing. Okay. Talked about that. Bread and circuses. Okay, we've told that story already. Okay. And I think you can see the moral of the story. In fact, most of the little vignettes I'm going to be sort of telling you is the answer is land property. The answer is the way that property is done. Because really the bread and circuses came because of the peculiarities of land tenure and the changes of land tenure in Rome. And it was, in a sense, a parallel process to what happened with the Greeks. But very, very different in terms of the actual institutional changes that were involved, but it had the same kind of effect. There were a number of solutions that came. Yep. Oh, they didn't actually have unemployment, but what they had was the rise of basically private property. Okay, with this story, the rise of the senators and the patrician land wealth kind of parallel what was happening with the Greeks. Okay? So it's not a parallel, not identity. And there certainly was the tendency towards private ownership, which didn't have like family ties. It was like a purely economic kind of thing. When you get to the late Roman Empire, especially out in the peripheries, in Spain and Gaul and out in Britain, it really was like a private ownership where the wealthy families, wealthy Roman families, owned vast amounts of land, and they had basically entire towns who were all slaves, all custody slaves. And you have some free people who were effectively paid like slaves, and they had circumstances with slave life, in these towns and these settlements who were amongst the land. It was kind of managed very much for like private enterprise kind of things, if you like. Makes sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay, some of the strategies that the emperor was able to hold land, if you like, for the purposes of government. Now, that's, if you like, one way of looking at that is that it's almost as though the government is becoming more mature, more complex. Right? By giving the emperor this land wealth, you're actually giving him the resource, the economic resources, to do a number of things, primarily to get the produce, to get the money or economic wealth, to pay for a paid army. You also give him, indirectly, the resources to give land to people, usually or often, as a reward for military service. And so what you have happening there is that a progressive development of what we would call a professional army. Professional army is where you've got people, not like doctors and lawyers, but an army made up of people whose only job is being soldiers. Okay? Previous to this, you had, if you like, a rural army, there's a word for it. What's that? Militia. Yeah, exactly. It was really a militia army. Here you've got people that's their job. Now what that means is that when a soldier sees their role not as an act of patriotism but as a paying proposition, economic kind of deal, it doesn't really matter whether the soldiers are coming from your own clan or your own people, or they're coming from somewhere else. It's simply an economic thing, and this is where we've got the contractors in the Middle East kind of serving the American military interests. Okay, doesn't really matter. They're getting paid. It's, business is business. Now, when you get that happening, first of all, its initial application was to attract Romans to participate in this. But as the Romans got to be more and more self-indulgent, they were seeing the writing on the wall, a bit like the Greeks a few hundred years earlier, and they're saying, oh, we couldn't be bothered. Where could they find the best soldiers? Well, the best soldiers in this particular case came from these tribal people that lived outside of the civilization of Rome, who still had a strong sense of social solidarity, and they had a commitment to support of their tribes, and they knew they had to fight for their life very often. And so they were militarily pretty shrewd and also organisationally capable. And so they started getting their professional army from outside the empire. Now, because the emperor had these economic resources to pay them, some of the attractions were they would go out to people out in the Never Never, and they'd say, if you come in to Rome, we will pay you as a soldier, and when you've finished your military service, we'll give you some land within the Roman Empire so you can live and enjoy the civilization of Rome. Right now you can only look across the river and see how civilized it is over here. And okay, we might be a bit preoccupied with wine, women and song and orgies and assassinating each other and all that sort of thing. You don't want that. But we do have nice roads, we do have nice water supply and all that sort of carry on. You can have all that if you service in the military for long enough, and we'll give you some land, and we'll give you Roman citizenship. People think, wow, that's a really good deal. I'm a bit sick of kind of running around out here in the frozen Never Never. And so a lot of people signed up. But patriotism wasn't really good. So what was happening was that you were getting a lot of people coming into Rome from outside who were culturally very different, but they were attracted to civilization and the pay and a lot of other things. And that was the emergence of our mercenary army. Let's look at how the mercenary army kind of worked out. Now, the mercenary army in the case of Rome were these chaps who didn't shave. The Romans thought that a sign of civilization was to go and scrape the face every morning, and in fact they apparently used to keep their swords so sharp they could shave with them. Now, ladies in the room won't understand this, right? But for blokes, have you ever tried shaving with a blunt razor blade? the Hebrews used to use it as a form of torture. It was the penalty for blasphemy. They would pluck out your beard, right? Because it really hurts. You can try it, if you like, and just tell the rest of the class what it feels like, right? I did it once, and I don't recommend it. It's very, very uncomfortable. Blokes do not like having their beard plucked out. And shaving with a blunt razor is kind of pretty close. But the Romans did it because they wanted to be civilised. They thought that having a nice smooth face showed that they were civilised people that were willing to, do what it takes to, present themselves nicely. And so the blokes were all shaving. Right? I would be interested in sort of taking a poll amongst the ladies now whether they think that's a good idea or not. I'm getting old and lazy, that's why I wear a beard. Now, what did the barbarians offer? The barbarians came from outside the Roman Empire, and so the Latin word, barbarians comes from the Latin word for a beard, by the way. What did they offer? The Romans offered the barbarians pay, respect, training, Roman citizenship, and that was all very attractive. And it attracted a number of Germanic leaders, and we mentioned the Germans kind of just a little bit earlier, attracted people like Alaric. What was Alaric famous for? Anyone remember? Tell me about Alaric. Okay. He was the Roman general who sacked Rome for his back pay. Now I have to tell you the story because usually in the way that we're told the history, especially in sort of English-speaking schools, you hear of the barbarians kind of surging down out of the frozen north and sweeping across the Roman Empire and laying waste the whole place, and they're really dreadful people. It turns out that in the entire history of Rome, in terms of the barbarians and so on, there are only 2 incursions into Rome by genuine barbarian raiding parties, at least that got anywhere. Okay? Just about all of the battles and all of the incursions by the supposed barbarians was actually events that happened as a result of them being disaffected Roman mercenaries. Alaric was a Roman general who was beating up on what we would now call, I can't remember if it was the Greeks or the Turks, but basically he was not too far away from Rome. He was fighting for Rome, and the Roman emperor did a bit of what you find the builders are going to be doing sort of shortly as the building industry sort of backs off a bit, right? Basically, you don't pay your subbies. So the emperor had Alaric out there fighting for Rome. 3 months went by and Alaric and his army didn't get any pay at all. They were tightening their belts and they weren't very happy. In the end, Alaric said, "Okay, fellas, let's go back to the boss and get our back pay." So he marched his army around down through the Italian peninsula and sacked Rome. Now, we don't normally hear that side of the story, and it's rather curious. When I started, sort of testing this in that 2 years where I thought this was all sort of baloney, I started reading these stories, and if you read the really detailed ones, the scholarly books of history about the sacking of Rome, they will say in parentheses or as a footnote, they will always say, yes, Alaric was a Roman general at the time, but they'll still, in the English history tradition, tell you that he was a barbarian sacking Rome because he was a bad guy and all the rest of it. But it was actually a pay dispute. It wasn't an invasion. And the same happens, as I say, for all of the other major issues, Normandy and all that sort of stuff. It was all events that happened by Roman generals who just happened to be mercenaries. One of the problems with mercenaries is they're not necessarily as kind of given to patriotism as your own homegrown soldiers. Okay, we've got 2 more slides. Oh my goodness, I thought we were going to finish early. I've been talking too much. Okay, this is an important story though, so I'll just kind of carry on and I'll try and finish it as soon as I can. Okay, we're on the way to the fall of Rome here. The fall of Rome isn't actually a fall, it's more of a internal death. It wasn't as though anyone came in from the outside. The fall of Rome sort of suggests that someone came along and pushed it. It wasn't like that really at all. Rome had become so self-indulgent that it wasn't able to support itself. Its own people weren't patriotic enough to want to sort of keep it together. it was being held together really by the work of the barbarian soldiers, who after a period of time were basically the leaders of all the Roman empires all through the empire. On the other hand, the actual Romans tended to be these landowners, and I sort of mentioned them before in answer to that earlier question, that they were these people that sort of owned vast tracts of land with large numbers of people living in a number of settlements, sort of towns or villages, whatever you want to call it, living like slaves. Now that was rather difficult because most of the people in the empire who were not in the army were all there as quasi-slaves. A small number of them were landowners. And they were out in places like Gaul and Brittany and all the rest of it, sort of out a long way away from home. Now, what would happen is that occasionally you'd get some, bad guys, whether they were simply bandits and outlaws or whether they were genuinely invaders, sort of, one of these groups of Vikings or someone who sort of came in from the frozen north, and that did, as it happened a couple of times. Okay. What would happen when there were problems? Well, the Roman landowners, normally, they would send a messenger down to Rome to talk to the emperor, and the emperor would send instructions and maybe a legion or two or something to come out and deal with the problem. Okay? And that's the way it used to work. The only problem is that as the landowners got sort of wealthier and fatter and lazier, and the emperor became sort of weaker and fatter and lazier, some invader would sort of come in, or some bad guy. The Roman landowner would send the runner off. Now remember, they have to walk or ride a horse or something. It takes a long time to go from the back of Brittany down to Rome and then come back again to get something sorted out. I mean, if you're some self-respecting outlaw, you would have done your job and left well and truly by then. And so the local landowners started to see that sending, and half the time, as it got sort of later in history, the Roman emperor couldn't be bothered anyway. I mean, he was too busy protecting his own interests and running his bread and circuses and stuff around Rome. He couldn't be bothered about what was happening out the back of Brittany somewhere. And so the landowners made a fairly intelligent decision. They went along, knocked on the door of the local leader, local Roman general, and said, look, we have got a problem with outlaws or invaders or whatever they were. Can you give us a hand? We're not going to wait to go and send the runner across to Rome to go and get your instructions to come back. The local German general said, yes, that's fine. But guess what? I haven't been paid for the last X number of months from the boss down in Rome. I'm going to need to feed my troops in order to come out and, give you law and order. I'll give you a deal. And the deal is this. By the way, these Roman generals at this stage all had blonde hair, blue eyes. Guess where they came from culturally? They were all Germans. So the German general of the Roman Empire, Roman army that was sort of living nearby, said to the genuinely Roman landowner, he said, a better deal here would be if we organised our property rights a bit the way that we used to in Germany before we came down into the empire. We used to have this sort of, traditional ownership, and it was sort of passed down through matrilineal line, da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. And we would allow leasehold and all that sort of carry. They would use exactly those terms. They're kind of like modern terms, right? But the German general of the Roman Empire would say to them, I'll tell you what, I will come out tomorrow and deal with your bad guys. If you give me formal title to your land, I will let you live on it, live very comfortably. You guys are very comfortable with wine, women and song. You've got more money than you know what to do with. You've got all these slaves. I'm not going to disturb any of that. I'm just going to ask you to pay me some rent. And in return for that rent, I will deal with the bad guys tomorrow. Sound like a good deal? Just think of the alternative for these Roman sort of landowners. They had a slave force that wasn't really going to work to go and keep the bad guys out. They've got sort of someone knocking on their door with, swords and bows and arrows and stuff, so they had a pretty urgent need. And the local German Roman army general was saying, give me your land title, pay me some rent, and I'm your man. Pretty easy decision, isn't it? Okay. And that was happening here, there, and almost everywhere across the empire. And it was a deal that was too good to be true, because the Roman landlords still had more money than they, or had more wealth than they knew what to do with, so they could still do their wine, women and song. The generals couldn't really give a hoot, as long as they paid the rent. And so you end up with this leasehold system kind of coming in. It wasn't exactly leasehold in a sense, but this concept of rent sort of came in. And then you end up with the hereditary land titles, and over a generation or 3 or 4, these German generals of the Roman army gave the leadership of their armies, local armies, to their kids and their kids' kids. Right? And after a while I thought, oh, this is a bit tedious, calling ourselves German generals of the Roman army. We've got a far simpler name for it. We'll call ourselves kings. And all over Europe, more or less at the same time, or actually sort of spread out over a modest period of time, were all these little kingdoms that popped up. And they were popping up in all of the places where the Roman army tended to have its main barracks. And they tended to have the land rights being given to them by all of these lazy, self-indulgent sort of Romans who couldn't do anything apart from wine, women and song and orgies and whatnot. And they were left in place as long as they kept most of their money and paid a bit of rent. So everybody was happy. What do you call this period of history? Anybody? You're almost there. So, the beginning of the Dark Ages, exactly right. There are a few points here. I've probably told the story that's going to be on these points. You see, we do have this cultural collapse of families. The Romans, oddly enough, got extremely good at family planning and also the demise of conventional family. By the time you're into the 1st, 2nd century after AD, the term for the plural of child was considered to be a joke. It was something that if you wanted to laugh as a comedian, you would simply say, oh, you've got children, as in you've got 2. Ha! What a fool you are. The Romans got to the stage where they only ever had 1 child if they had any at all. They were extremely good at family planning, and they also didn't bother about getting married, which has sort of got parallels with what we've got happening today culturally. That is kind of related to sort of wider social things, the sort of broad ethics, their sense of property and so on, all connected together. What did the Germans offer? The Germans came in, and basically they were able to do what they were doing. They were able to come in with their military leadership, largely because it was built on the social organisation of their strong tribal values, which are strong family values. They didn't sort of practice family planning. They didn't sort of run off on their wives and husbands and stuff. So you've got this sort of introduction of a set of fairly simple, fairly universal values, if you like, cultural values, that came in almost through the back door through the Germans. We call it the beginning of the Dark Ages, and in our next class we will talk about that a little bit in more detail. And it was dark to the extent that because it got nasty, because it sort of got to be very local, and the empire-wide organisation sort of fell apart, you could no longer rely on widespread commerce and people sort of spending a lot more time simply keeping alive. But that's really a story for another day. I think I'll just put up the rest of these. Okay, we got to that. Okay, and just as one little point, I mentioned the colour of the hair and colour of the eyes of the Roman generals at this time. It's also one of the reasons why all our fairy tales tend to have, like European fairy tales, the Grimm's fairy tales and that sort of thing, what do the princesses look like? All blonde-haired, blue eyes. Now, was that just something that the Grimm's brothers kind of worked out for, poetic delight? I don't have either of those things, I don't think, so I kind of feel sort of a bit miffed. But it's a historical reality, and it actually sort of points back to this political change that happened as we went from the Roman Empire into what we call the Dark Ages. Next time when we meet, okay, I think I've talked about most of those. Next time I meet, we'll talk about the Dark Ages in more detail, and 3 eras of European history that happen pretty much after, or in succession, sort of starting with the Dark Ages.